I'm speaking here as a historian of science, and by default, so to speak, historians have difficulties in dealing with the future. But we can deal with present-day sciences, and that very much is what I'm going to do here. I've been allotted an hour of time. Now half of it is already used up by running over the schedule, but I hope you bear with me that I read for about 35-40 minutes of paper. The relation between body and mind has surprisingly often been spelled out in terms of instruments and machines, regardless of its philosophical nature. I want to start by jumping right into this by pointing to a strange coincidence from the 1870s. In 1872, Friedrich Nietzsche published his Birth of Tragedy. In this book, among other things, for which the book is much better known, he lamented that with the invention of machines, ancient lore, the wisdom of the myth, had got lost because they were replaced by the deus ex machina, namely the god of machines, the belief in knowledge and a life led by science. Nietzsche, being a philologist and classics scholar, dated this shift to the transformation of Greek tragedy from its early to its classic form. But he himself wrote this essay at a time that saw the rise of modern science and industrialization as those changed the world in hitherto non-anticipated ways. And in fact, Nietzsche himself commented upon this coincidence in an opening comment that he added later to the Birth of Tragedy. At the very same time, 2 years actually before the publication of the Birth of Tragedy, two young physician scientists changed once and for all the relation between mind and brain and machines. They experimented with the application of electric currents to the cortex. Stimulating different sites on the cortex of a dog, Gustav Fritsch and Eduard Hitzig observed muscular contractions in the opposite side of the body. Their findings were developed further by the British physiologist David Ferrier in experiments with monkeys. Later, the animal experiment was transferred to humans, resulting in a second replacement, the transformation of the human body into an electromechanical device, executing automatic movements due to the electrical stimulation of the centers of control. This was to happen a generation later when Wilder Penfield started to introduce cerebral stimulation into the operating theater, and that will be the first part I will be talking about. Since 200 years, new research methods kindle to conceive of the brain in a changing theories of models, metaphors, creating a dynamic exchange systems. For a long time, tools and instruments simply lacked complexity for using them as compelling analogues, yet their very limitations could be employed for demonstrating the brain's functional superiority. With the arrival of automata, and especially in the 20th century with the arrival of the computer, the relation between brains and machines changed. What used to be a comparison turned into a rivalry. Now, the metaphorical explanation of brains as machines acquired a material reality, and the philosophical program of materialism turned into reductionism. As if to testify to its allegedly anti-human nature, humans lost this competition, and other supposed indicators of human intelligence. But at this very moment, toward the end of the 20th century, the emphasis shifted to other aspects of human nature, such as empathy, and the social brain that apparently escaped this machine comparison. At the very same time, however, the arrival of functional imaging promised to discard of functional comparisons in general and to simply conflate technological visualization with its neurophysiological substrate. And this is, as I'm going to, with this now, I want to unpack a little bit in 10 smallish steps. The first is the tape and the electrode, the tape recorder and the electrode. Wilder Penfield would open a patient's skull, expose the surface of the brain, and map its functional topography by stepping down point by point with a stimulating electrode along the brain, thus eliciting the respective physiological responses. As you see in the cover illustration of the Scientific American, a drawing of the scene in the operating theater, and the topographical map on the right top of these corresponding spots between the body's periphery and the surface of the cerebral cortex. And at the right is Wilder Penfield himself in Montreal in the operating theater. For doing so, the operating theater had not only been converted into a special electrophysiological laboratory, but the operating team and the patients also embarked together on an expedition into new territory. The tip of the stimulating electrode acted as a voyager into the lands usually hidden not only inside the skull, but deep in the walls of the psyche. In Penfield's hand, the surprise came when the electrode entered memoria, the lands of yesterday. Penfield perfected neurostimulation to a form of time travel. Here, Penfield's electrical exploration resulted in the patient undergoing experiences of a forced déjà vu. The stimulating electrode acted as a memory activator, bringing back a distinct single recollection, as Penfield wrote down, not a mixture of memories or their generalization. The recollections evoked by the electroactivation retained the rich details of an original experience, and they often did so even stronger than compared to a normal act of remembering, or as some patients said, somewhat more real. For Penfield, the accuracy and comprehensiveness of the memory apparatus as accessed by means of the stimulating electrode was most remarkable. I quote, "The subject feels again the emotion which the situation originally produced in him, and he is aware of the same interpretation, true or false, which he himself gave to the experience in the first place. Thus, evoked recollection is not the exact photographic or phonographic reproduction of past scenes and events." Penfield in a paper from 1952. Penfield's experiments gave William James's notion of a continuous stream of consciousness, as you see it scribbled down along the spiral on this sketch, late sketch drawn by Penfield, gave William James's notion a material substrate, though this had once just been a metaphor. Now experimental research had shown that somewhere inside the head there was a machine, not exactly a photograph or phonograph, but both models worked so well here because they captured precisely what memory was not, an objective representation of the outside world. The memory machine, by contrast, was an automatic registration unit for the subjective interpretations of sensory information. The explanatory strategy of metaphors and models could thus be extended beyond the limitations of a particular technological model, when the very limitations of the technological model explained the specificity of the functionality of the brain, typically in terms of its super-technical functionality, as Penfield did it here with his differentiation of the human memory system from a standard phonograph or a camera. I come to the second point, median model for exploring difference. The master of this strategy of elucidating the psyche in technical terms beyond the physical space of a technological model obviously was Sigmund Freud. arguing that the realm of psychic processes must not be conflated with the physical space, this physical space of the brain's anatomy that Freud himself had studied very carefully in Vienna with Theodor Meinert. Freud broke with the reductionism of the machine theory. A well-versed writer, Freud used analogies and technological models for elucidating the flaws of any naturalistic theory of the brain. He mobilized models and metaphor precisely as imperfect tools, which can be studied in his many strategic comments on the limits of particular visual metaphors or functional analogies. A famous example is Freud's comparison of the psyche with the city of Rome in Civilization and Its Discontent. The point of comparison is not the large number of ancient buildings, nor their existence to this day, but the very unimaginability of a Rome that has been preserved in all its buildings ever built. Such a Rome may be thought of, but can no longer be visualized. In order to gain clarity on its significance, the analogy has to be driven beyond the limits of visual representation. For Freud, the narrative quality and logical structure of language allowed access to the specific dimension of time, so central to psychoanalysis, in a linguistic representation which built on the physical model but left it metaphorically behind. The pictorial language of the illustration inevitably fell back behind the mature concept, but precisely this failure illustrates the complexity of a figure of thought. Freud's concluding remark on the Rome comparison stressed his strategically inverted use of topographical metaphors. I quote Freud, Our attempt seems to be an idle game. It has only one justification. It shows us how far we are from mastering the characteristics of mental life by representing them in pictorial terms, end of quote. Freud developed a visual argument that the physical apparatus, the psychical apparatus, can only be described by language and not represented by anatomical visualizations, because in his theory, the psyche followed the structural logic of a symbolic space and not the anatomy of a geometrical topography. The series of technological models mobilized for grasping the brain's functional capabilities testifies to the investment in brain research for addressing more fundamental questions about the nature of the human. Since more than 200 years, the brain has increasingly been explored as a center for reasoning on the condition humaine. Models in brain research typically mediated between socio-historical questions about meaning, function, and significance on the one hand, and the realm of organic structures and mechanical functions on the other. In this perspective, technological models are media in several ways, as they transform and transmit information according to their technological specifications and mediate thus between the world of mechanics, biology, and culture. The metaphorical invasion of the body by electrical tools summed up to more than mere analogies. For the German philosopher Ernst Kapp, philosopher of technology, the similarities between biological and engineering solutions simply proved that technology, quite generally, was nothing but an externalization of the body's intrinsic functional principles, or with the term that Kapp invented for that, technology is an organic projection, an externalization of a biological functional principle. As he called this mechanism in a book from 1877, so again from the very same period as I started with Nietzsche. In consequence of this technological externalization, the biological operations of the body become accessible to scientific exploration and amenable to intervention, setting into operation a process of open-ended perfection, a co-evolution of man and machine that ever since has fascinated media theorists. A century later, digesting the impact of the emergence of television, Marshall McLuhan echoed Kapp with his famous statement, "With the arrival of electric technology, man extended or set outside himself a life model of the central nervous system itself." The idea of electric technology as the life model of the nervous system, or of industry as a life model of the entire human body, appears to be directly illustrated in a popular book dating from the mid-1920s, when new communication technologies, in particular radio, film, cinema, added further options for spelling out the organization of the body. Physiological processes, the physiological processes when sitting in front of the screen in a movie theater, for example, could be described as the eyes taking the pictures in like a film camera, and the film is then being processed in a first station in the brainstem, and from there the information is projected, channeled to the back of the head, where the visual center is. The question of what exactly is being shown here pales in view of the many amalgamations of body and technology that Kahn offers in the more than, I think, 2,000 illustrations in his book, depicting the human body as a wonderful machine that technology can hardly catch up with. The examples here are taken from Kahn's opus magnum, his popular textbook, The Life of Man. Kahn's recipe of success was the combination of a lucid style of writing with intriguing visuals. At first glance, Kahn's world of images gives a perfect representation of Kapp's concept of organ projection. Kahn, however, reversed the explanatory strategy. While Kapp postulated technical inventions to be based on biological principles, Kahn explained body functions by comparing them with new inventions. Where Kapp, or later McLuhan, speculated about epistemic linkages between technology and the body, Kahn familiarized the body's alien organic insight by recourse to common inventions, as if a form of techno-literacy would bear the potential to reconnect with the body's machinery in new ways. Kahn visualized with his popular images how human ingenuity in instrument making and machine building would allegedly arrive at a stage where machines epitomized the complexity of the human body, and the process of technological civilization should ultimately arrive at an enculturation of nature into technology. Oops. Form follows function, the end of the competition. The idea of a perfect technology, Kahn's industrialization of mind and body, met with another strand in the history of the mobilization of models for explaining the functions of the brain, the logical machine. Calculating machines had their own history of metaphors with as brains of brass, dating back to long before the availability of the first electronic machines, with their thousands of vacuum tubes. Soon later, machines became available that used electricity for logical operations and calculations, and the gap between the world of material processes and symbolic actions appeared to be closed. From this moment onwards, brains were discussed as biological instantiations of such machines. Brains had become computers. Although computers were still immobile, garage-sized technological systems that did not resemble brains physically, they quickly dominated the theorizing about brains. Computers used electricity for their operations, just as physiology had revealed neurons to communicate by electric impulses. And there were even some correspondences between the all or none principle the physiological code among neurons, and the digital code in the computer. Computers dominated much of brain research and public understanding of mind and brain throughout the 20th century. Paradoxically, the celebrated victory of IBM's Deep Blue over Kasparov in 1997 made the hitherto deeply ingrained analogy of brain and computer look superficial and falter. The computer, however, was not just another step in a long sequence of models, which it also was. In a certain sense, the computer was the last, the ultimate model, so far at least. It has proven irreplaceable. What newer tool or gadget could possibly replace it? What could stand in as the next central metaphor? The World Wide Web is sometimes said to be the brain's next top model, and yet, by its physical dispersion, the internet is too intangible to serve as model in a way similar to how the computer once did. The next section, the fifth, the plastic brain, what you see is what you get. With the vanishing of the computer metaphor, the model changed sides, the model changed sides, and the computer turned into a tool. This transition marks more than just an episode in the history of the brain. It is the end of the history of the brain machine because it coincided with the rise of a new visualization technique, functional imaging. Functional neuroimaging opened a new chapter in the history of brain research, the entry point of brainhood, the positioning of the neurosciences as the universal frame of reference for addressing human nature. Today, the debate about the shortcomings of particular models for the brain or about the appropriateness of the machine metaphor in general appears nostalgically futile or pointless when the neurosciences now offer human society's brain images instead of machine models. The desire for the real is here also played out massively. Models and metaphors may fail or betray, but they typically operate in the differentiality between the object and the concept, while images, as objectifying representations, always already tend to conflate the object with its representation. Here emerges the coming challenge of the neurosciences. Brain research has moved into a space that Paul Valery once characterized as the interior of thinking, where, as Valery continues, the interior of thinking where there is no thinking. Today, all kinds of fascinating brain images invite to take false colored pictures from the interior of thinking for an answer to the question, what thinking is. Section 6, voodoo correlations. A recent paper famously accused this branch of advanced research in the neurosciences, in particular the social neurosciences, of producing voodoo correlations. The paper you see here is actually this very publication, but because it has been discussed so heavily before its publication, the title had eventually been changed to this more austere, puzzlingly high correlations. But it's across the globe known as the voodoo paper because of the initial title, voodoo correlations. Pointing wittingly, though unknowingly, towards a rich topic, how can the burgeoning field of functional imaging be compared with animistic practices? In what ways does modern technoscience provide new tools for animating brains? And what light does such a reading shed on the dynamics of brain research? The catchy title of the publication was just the finishing touch in a perfectly orchestrated campaign, and that is why we know of the paper before its publication. Between Christmas and New Year's Eve of 2009, news spread about an imminent attack on an entire research field, voodoo correlations in social neurosciences. In mid-January, Nature picked up the story, and the New Scientist, from which I quote from the editorial, many other blogs and papers and even newspapers, I quote from the New Scientist: "Modern-day neuroscience has produced some wonderful science, including endless technicolor images of the brain at work, headline-grabbing papers about the areas that light up when registering emotions. Researchers charted those sad spots that winked on in woman mourning the end of a relationship. The areas that got fired up when thinking about infidelity, or those that surged in arachnophobes when they thought they were about to see a spider. The subjective subject of feeling seemed at last to be becoming objective. Now it seems that a good chunk of the papers in this field contain exaggerated claims according to an analysis which suggests that voodoo correlations often inflate the link between brain areas and particular behaviors." From the start, reports had been truly fantastic. Social action, aggression, fairness, so the readers and the public at large had been told, have now been revealed, thanks to the new visualization method, to be proper neurobiological entities, no mere social or cultural constructs. Now, more than 5 years later, after this debate on the voodoo paper, social neuroscience is active as ever before. This is one of the accused papers by all of these papers came from the top labs. This is Chris Friss and Tanya Zinger's cooperation, for example. Now, more than 5 years later, social neuroscience is as active as ever before. Compared to the massiveness of the attack, the effects of the critique may be regarded regrettably little. I do not want to reopen the debate on voodoo correlations, but I want to ask, what does it mean when actors from within the neurosciences recycle animistic concepts such as voodoo, and be it just as a mode of critique? Analogy, metonymy, and metaphor. Souls, spirits, psyches, minds, ghosts are notoriously problematic entities in modern scientific Western cultures, which already resist the classification as thing, object, idea, or concept. But precisely because of their resistance, psychic research and the neurosciences may productively be described as soul-catching activities. What does it yield to describe current practice in the neurosciences as resembling animistic practices, or perhaps even as a revival of some kind of animism? Is it possible to provide a thick description of neuroscientific research practices and their effects in an animistic perspective? What do we gain from it? Animism was once a concept for describing allegedly primitive religions in a Eurocentric perspective. The normative modern understanding of the concepts hold animism to be a, quote, pre-modern social and psychological mechanism by means of which nature and things were erroneously endowed with souls and agency. A more recent discussion, however, revived the concept of animism precisely for critiquing the modern dichotomist epistemology of subject-object, nature-culture, rational and irrational, and I think it's no coincidence that the Anthropocene Project actually hosted an entire session on animism as part of their project. The conceptualization of animism for characterizing allegedly primitive forms of religion obviously followed from a colonialist European perspective upon non-European cultures. Animism owed its plausibility to the newly established evolutionary framework separating more advanced cultures in terms of modern rationality from others, and thereby animism implicitly addressed many epistemological problems back in Europe at the time. In its polemical and ideological sense, animism did not and will not solve any epistemological problems, but it may acquire new meanings as a descriptive term for capturing the eerie qualities of scientific practices themselves, pointing to the paradoxical and animating effects of endorsed technological scientific procedures as the flip side of rationalization and the belief in progress. In the pure and cold searchlight of scientific experiment, the soul was first relegated to the head, where it then was explained as the mind side and the affective inside of a purely natural material brain, structured by evolution and anatomy, governed by physiology. This naturalized epistemology still holds. There are no ghosts under the sun, not even inside the brain. But with its constructive powers, the neurosciences have helped to establish a still inflating array of new things. Foucault once described the endless focusing of society on sex as unintended consequence of the Victorian regime. Along similar lines, the neurosciences managed not just to establish themselves as the central institution for talking and debating questions in relation to the soul, they managed to keep supernatural psychic powers alive by declaring to purify the world of such irrational wrong beliefs. And perhaps this is not just an unintended side effect of rational research and scientific progress, but its inherent structure, be it as its discursive effect or as philosophical insight along the lines of Hans Blumenberg's concept of Umbesetzungen. Blumenberg describes with this term Umbesetzung the historical process advancing by repetitively changing responses to existential needs and metaphysical questions since Homo erectus left the rainforest and faced visibility in the open, forcing him to two things: anticipation and tool use. Experimental research and modern technology come up with ever more subtle strategies for registering traces of its activity. Apparently, there is so far no escape from materializing the soul. And perhaps it is time to think of ways for accommodating the soul-producing effects of scientific research. I come to the last short sections of my presentation: reverse engineering. The advent of functional imaging had rekindled older debates. Initially, the advent of functional imaging had rekindled older debates about free will, human autonomy. Today, this radical reductionism that dominated the days of the decade of the brain has lost much of its appeal. Social neuroscience is the game of the day. Obviously, social neuroscience is not about declaring social cognition to be something immaterial or spiritual outside of human brains, but it demonstrates meditation, other spiritual practices to affect the human brain physiologically, as quite famously described here on the homepage of Tanya Singer's lab. Social neuroscience operates from A to Z in a naturalized epistemology. Along this trajectory, however, it populates the world with a growing number of entities which until now had been discarded as being dubious, since they fell clearly outside of the realm of material objects. Before functional imaging, there was no conceivable way to determine, for example, fairness as an objective brain state, apart from Franz Gall's phrenological chart. One may argue that this research still pursues its reductionistic agenda when it extends the realm of natural scientific research into the social. But the ontologies of functional imaging, with their steadily growing numbers of new entities taken from the world of social interaction, create new families of hybrid objects, half social, half scientifically furbished with a natural basis. They share their nature as hybrids with many objects currently under investigation by the sciences, which also have come into being as constructed natural objects by means of technoscientific arrangement. That has been one of the top topics in history and philosophy of science since Gaston Bachelard to Bruno Latour. But perhaps the new brain states are hybrids in a new form, since they are not in the same mode, artificially made or technologically created like other nature-cultural hybrids. Like genes or quarks, empathy as naturalized entity relies on a complex ensemble of technoscientific practices, bringing it into existence as a scientific concept and as a material thing in the brain, stabilizing as a technoscientific object. But unlike genes or quarks, empathy arrived in the lab from the live world of modern society. Social neuroscience operates in reverse direction, taking its concepts from the realm of culture and turning them into natural objects. In addition, these newly naturalized objects established by social neuroscience are supposed to function in the physiological spaces of the living brain. In the visualization practices surrounding the scanner and, on the macro level, human interaction, according to the symbolic logic of culture in addition to the physiological logic of the brain itself. In this regard, social neuroscience established natural objects with more than natural qualities. Functional neuroimaging brings artificial neuroscience and dead brain sciences closer to life. It literally animates its objects under investigation by linking a perfusion pattern with psychic, social, cognitive, cultural significance. Read in this context, the title of Wooll's paper acquires another layer of meaning, giving a twist to the debate as so far discussed here. Section 9, Utopian Neurocultures. So Wu was right and wrong at the same time, but in a more sophisticated way than he had anticipated. Voodoo, inappropriate or not very useful as an accusation of wrongdoings, re-enters the discussion as descriptive category of scientific practices in the neurosciences. Until recently, neuroscience always found inanimate neuroanatomical, neurophysiological substrate wherever it searched for the psyche. With functional imaging, specific patterns become agents of culture. Social neuroscience is but one aspect of a larger shift away from traditional reductionism. And Gregory just mentioned that. From mirror neurons' neuronal plasticity to experiments employing the scanner as a feedback device for therapeutic interventions, current concepts in the neurosciences share an emphasis on dynamic affectivity. For at least 200 years, progress in the neurosciences was so overwhelming for the researchers themselves, for the scientists, that they concluded brain research would soon come to a happy end. The breakthrough was almost there. It is easy for the historian to laugh at such a naivete, but a historically more significant insight is waiting here, namely that the object of investigation has changed over time and as consequence of this research process itself. Although the brain is still the brain, research into this object has affected it in a way that it got much more complicated. Research changed the brain, making it more complex, adding one level after another, layer above layer in the understanding of the brain. Compared to the turn of the century, knowledge about the brain has multiplied, but so has the brain's complexity. Along this trajectory of increasing complexity of the brain as natural thing, the entanglement of instruments and media continues. The brain's complexity, although conceived as being its nature, is the very material result of previous research into the brain. The complexity is at the same time an empirical fact and the result of the constructive work of experimental research. It must be understood as an artifact in the precise sense of the term that Bachelard had in mind when he described modern physics. Because of the productivity of research in the neurosciences, this dynamic of the shifting frontier will, at least for a while, continue. Tens of thousands of neuroscientists literally work on making the brain more difficult. 10 and last, In Search of Alliance Technology. There may be different options. The history of media innovations and new visualization strategies offers ample examples. Almost a century ago, Walter Benjamin observed the emergence of film and cinema. Contemplating the potentially liberating powers of new media technologies, Benjamin speculated about the arrival of a second technology, designed not to conquer but to liberate nature, and especially human nature, in the commented in notes on the Kunstwerk paper. According to him, this would have to be an alliance technology, generating some form of collective innovation and opening up new spaces of interaction and intervention. Are we witnessing today a transformation in this direction? Overcoming the limits of human nature has been an old dream, revived with almost every technological innovation and revitalized in particular with the new bio and information sciences and technologies. Meanwhile, the neurosciences, as I've hoped to demonstrate here with a few examples, have embarked on a course away from predetermined programs and towards the plasticity of dynamic open interactions. The goal of these future neurosciences will no longer be a complete deciphering of the brain's anatomy, physiology, or programmed functionality, as these do no longer determine anything. The future of the neurosciences has become the open, animated brain. Whether this will be a utopian brain in Benjamin's sense, though, remains doubtful as long as the neurosciences fit seamlessly the global framework of capitalized knowledge markets. Wittingly but unknowingly, voodoo correlations pointed the direction. Can we imagine the future of brain research as a perfected dream machine? There's an installation by which I want to conclude my presentation by the British, actually, artist Louise Wilson, combining an ostensibly Freudian couch with a video screen showing a brain scan, so modern brain imaging. And actually the video monitor is very close above the couch, making it rather uncomfortable to lie down. Nonetheless, the spectator is asked to lay down by a pre-recorded voice and then to touch the screen and caress on the screen a pink dot that I think you may recognize on the small inlet. And the voice explains that this pink spot is pain being experienced by the brain that's been visualized on the screen. All this is obviously pre-recorded, but as soon as the viewer does so, touches the screen in this area, the pink blurb somehow vanishes. The title of the installation is Possessed, and the artist obviously created the work in 1996 as a critical comment on the rising obsession with neuroimaging. Perhaps her installation also offers different readings. The phantasm of wish fulfillment extends beyond Freudian theorizing and its re-instantiations by current brain imaging technologies. Animating brains has become the game of the day. Thank you.